Hello and welcome back. If you somehow haven't heard, the full release of Risk of Rain 2 is out now, and man oh man, the 1.0 update was a doozy. Tons of changes, tons of new content, and an insane final boss battle, and a badass new character. I'm absolutely in love with this update so far. If you're on PC and you somehow haven't played it yet, I cannot recommend it enough. The final boss alone is worth the full price of the game. I won't spoil anything here, but yes, it's that awesome. Anyways, with all the new items and the changes to old items, I need to make an addendum to my initial ranking video. That's probably where most of you are coming from actually, and if you aren't, I highly recommend checking that video out first because that has my full thoughts on all the items pre 1.0. This video is more of an update to that one rather than its own individual ranking. Which, by the way, I can't stress this enough. I am genuinely blown away by the response that video has gotten. When I was making the video, I thought I'd be lucky if it hit 100 views, and now as I'm writing the script, it's already over 3,000. You all are crazy, thank you so much. Anyways, let's get back to the topic at hand. I'll be using the same ranking system as before. Quick refresher on that, the F tier is literally just the fuel array. The E tier means an item can still be useful, but is more likely going to hold you back in some way. The D tier is for items that won't hinder you, but are generally just underwhelming. The C tier is for items that are okay, but are either too situational or just don't scale well. The B tier is for items that aren't super amazing, but are solid enough all around. The A tier is for items that are either still somewhat situational, or just aren't quite as groundbreaking as the S tier items. The S tier is for items that are basically amazing in every situation, and the SS tier is an arbitrary tier I made exclusively for the 57 leaf clover. And of course, like last time, this list is based around monsoon difficulty with no artifacts enabled. With all that out of the way, let's talk about some items, shall we? First, I'll be covering all the old items that will be receiving new rankings. Lots of changes happened, mostly buffs, so a lot of items will actually be going up in ranking. There are still a few that will be going down due to changes they received, and there are also a few items that didn't receive any changes themselves, but will be receiving new rankings due to the context of these other item changes. First up, we have the fresh meat, which is going to drop down a tier to C. Now, fresh meat didn't actually receive any changes, but other healing items were buffed to be a lot more consistent. Before, fresh meat outperformed a lot of other healing items in the early game, but would eventually be outperformed by other items. Now, fresh meat is already somewhat overshadowed in the early game without being any stronger in the late game. Next, we'll be looking at the Monster Tooth Necklace, which used to be in the D tier. Now, the healing orbs it drops actually heal for 2% of your max HP per stack, on top of the 8 flat HP. So, as long as you have more than 400 HP, which is not very hard to do, it's actually a buff, and it scales a lot better. The collection radius is still fairly small, so it's only getting bumped up to a C, but hey, it's much better than it used to be. Now we'll be looking at the other formerly D tier healing item, the medkit. The medkit received a similar change in that now instead of healing a flat 24 health per stack, it heals a flat 20 plus 5% of your max health, and each stack adds another 5%. So, like the Monster Tooth Necklace, it just scales better and better the later your run goes. Since it's a much larger amount of healing, as well as being more consistent, the medkit is getting bumped up to B. Never thought I'd be saying this, but I'm actually glad to see medkits now. Now, briefly, I wanted to cover the personal shield generator. It won't actually be receiving a change to its rank, more so I just wanted to clarify my stance on it, or the E tier as a whole rather. I do not think shield gens are useless. I think they can be quite good in certain situations actually. The problem is that personally, I don't think the benefits outshine the downside of interfering with one-shot protection at later stages. You can still absolutely use them and get good mileage out of them, same goes for the crowdfunder, and yes, even the corpse blooms sometimes. The E tier essentially just means that the item comes with a drawback that I think is too severe for the benefit it gives you in most situations. I just want to make it clear that I do not think these items are useless by any means. Next, we'll be looking at the Tri-Tip Dagger. The Tri-Tip itself didn't actually receive a change, rather the bleed debuff as a whole received a slight rework. Now the duration of each stack of bleed is refreshed when a new one is applied to the same enemy, meaning as long as you can keep your fire up on an enemy, you can potentially have infinite stacks of bleed. So now, bleed actually scales a lot better than it used to, so tri-tips will be getting bumped up to an A. Definitely much more impactful than they were. Now please just make Akrid's Blight work the same way. Now we'll be looking at the War Banner. The War Banner actually received new visual effects and looks much better and isn't quite as obtrusive as it used to be. Ergo, S tier. Fantastic item. That was my attempt at a joke. Did you like it? In all seriousness, the actual gameplay change the War Banner received is now one will be placed when you activate the teleporter. This is a huge deal, as the biggest problem, other than it being kind of small without a couple stacks, is that the further you get in a run, the less you'll actually level up. So the War Banner would come into play less and less. Now you're guaranteed at least one every stage, and in an advantageous area too. Now, since the buff itself still isn't that huge, and as previously mentioned, the radius is still fairly small without a few stacks, it's only getting bumped up to B. But trust me, B tier is still a good spot. Next up is the Death Mark, which actually won't be moving up or down at all, but I wanted to cover the change it received briefly. If you remember from the last video, Death Mark was actually bugged, and it didn't increase the damage buff with each tier like it was supposed to. Well, that bug wasn't actually fixed, but instead Death Mark was reworked to stay at 50% increased damage, but the duration of the buff itself is now increased with each stack. This change isn't exactly huge, and it barely changed how effective Death Mark actually is, but I wanted to make sure I addressed it anyways. Next, there's the Old War Stealth Kit, which will be dropping down to B. The Stealth Kit didn't actually receive any changes to it this patch. Rather, after looking at the rest of the items in the A tier after this patch, I felt like it was just ranked a bit too highly. I still think Stealth Kits are very helpful, but in hindsight, I felt as though I just oversold it a bit. Next, we have Runald's Band and Chiaro's Band. I'll be covering the bands together, as the change they received put them basically at the same level. So, the bands were pretty good items, right? A little on the strong side, perhaps, so what change did they get? Well, instead of an 8% proc chance, they now both have a 100% proc chance on any hit that deals at least 400% damage. Runald's Band specifically now actually does 250% damage per stack, instead of 250 plus 125 per stack. And the debuff it applies now lasts 3 seconds per stack, instead of just 3 seconds. Chiaro's Band, on the other hand, now only does 300% damage per stack, but its hitbox was increased from 4.8 meters to 13, and it now remains stationary instead of moving slightly after triggering. Now you're probably thinking, holy shit, these sound insane now, are they both S tier now? Unfortunately, there's a catch, and it's a pretty big one too. While they have a 100% proc chance on any 400% damage or greater hit, they have a 10-second internal cooldown that cannot be reduced at all. So why is this a big deal? Once every 10 seconds doesn't sound too bad. Well, in the early game, if you're playing a character that can actually proc them, they do actually feel better to use. Since most characters have at least one ability to proc them, you have some level of control over them now, which is nice. Unfortunately, the further your run goes, the more items you'll start to get that will be able to proc them, and the more you get, the less control you'll actually have. Eventually, it'll start to get to a point where you basically have no control of them. The problem is, previously you could proc them left and right with enough items, especially if you had a clover or two. Now the later you get, they just start to perform worse and worse than they used to. Anything past the second loop or so now, they'll start to feel really low impact compared to your other items. They're still very strong, but the fact that you can only get them once every 10 seconds really holds them back compared to how frequently you can get some other items, especially with some clovers. Overall, they get an A now, which I know is the same as the Runalds used to have actually, but I still wanted to cover them both at the same time due to how drastic the change was. To sum up my thoughts, they feel better early on, but their synergy with other items falls off dramatically the later you go, and they start to feel like they used to, but worse. Now we have the Head Stomper. They made this thing scale with the height of the fall, with the max of 10,000% damage in a 100-meter radius. So, now, if you can get up to the max height, you basically just turn yourself into a nuke. The problem is, that's a pretty big if. Getting to that height on most stages is going to require very specific terrain or a lot of feathers or movement abilities. Plus, it's still fairly slow and impractical. While it does a lot of damage now, it's still very situational, and the passive jump height increase is still annoying sometimes. As much as it pains me, I'm gonna have to bump it up to a C. This is still probably my least favorite item in the game, but I'll give it credit where it's due. Next we have the Interstellar Desk Plant. Color me impressed, this thing isn't half bad now. Not only did they double the healing rate, they increased the radius dramatically. Instead of 3 meters plus 1.5 per stack, which is the same rate as the fungus I might add, now it's 5 meters plus 5 per stack. So not only is just one stack already bigger than 2 used to be, the radius scales much faster, and it heals twice as much. All of that, plus there's a new item that it synergizes pretty well with. Yeah, this thing gets a B now. Not bad at all. Now we're going to look at the shaped glass. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. They didn't actually change anything about shaped glass itself. Rather, they made some adjustments to one-shot protection. Now, if your health is lowered by any means, i.e. glass, tonic afflictions, etc., that is no longer counted as your max health as far as one-shot protection is concerned. It now remembers what your max health should be, excluding any reductions like those, and uses that in your one-shot protection. So, if your maximum health is reduced below 90%, you no longer have your one-shot protection. Meaning, if you pick up a single stack of glass, your one-shot protection is gone now. This hurts stacking glass's viability badly. However, considering how insanely powerful it was before, that still doesn't mean it's bad. Glass is still very strong, and I'm going to give it an A now. With glass, you have to play much more carefully than before, especially if you plan on stacking it at all. Now, personally, I've been thinking glass deserved a nerf for a while now, and this is exactly what I would have done. As I explained in the original video, having your max HP before was honestly a good thing, so doubling all your damage as well as making you harder to kill was just too powerful. Now, to me, shaped glass is the quintessential lunar item. It perfectly embodies the risk versus reward philosophy of the lunar items. Previously, I'd have considered this to be the second strongest item in the game after the 57-leaf clover, but unlike the clover, glass was just straight up unbalanced. Now, it's much more in line with the rest of the items. Good stuff, Hopu. Next up, we have the Effigy of Grief. Man oh man was this thing bad. A 50% slow on enemies and a 20 armor reduction was okay, but since it affected you and dropped directly where you were standing, using it would effectively cripple you until you could get out of the radius. There was way too much risk involved to justify using it, but now it places directly where your crosshair is located with the max of 5 uses per stage. So now, the effigy has become a very strategical item. You have to be smart with where you put it because of the limited uses, as well as that area becoming a danger zone for the rest of the stage. It's very interesting to play around with, and it's honestly pretty good now. Mostly just against bosses, but it's actually pretty solid. I'm gonna have to give it a C now. I never thought I'd see the day where I would be glad to willingly pick up this thing. Now we'll be looking at the Hellfire Tincture. While the radius and duration increase are nice, the biggest buff it received is now it has another character that can reasonably use it. And fairly early too. That character is everyone's favorite good boy Acrid. Now that Acrid has the regenerate buff and his melee playstyle is overall more effective, he can actually make good use of it like the mercenary. It's only being bumped up to C because it's still rather impractical or just outperformed on the other characters, but hey, it's not as niche anymore. And that is it for all the old items that got new rankings. There are a few items that received changes that weren't mentioned here, but those changes didn't put them in a new tier. For example, Little Disciple got a buff, but it's still not quite an S due to the restriction of sprinting. Guillotines got nerfed, but so did the health pool of elites, so in reality not a whole lot changed, etc. Now we'll be looking at the brand new items, and I can't wait to talk about these. A lot of these are super interesting and really strong. Let's get into it. First up, we have a different sort of item, the new legendary item, Defensive Microbots. Now normally you have to be playing the captain to get this item. It will never drop naturally, and you can't even get it from a red essence with the artifact of command enabled. It's a passive of the captain and he always spawns with it. So unfortunately this is another item I probably shouldn't even rank, but hey, I ranked the beads of fealty in the fuel array. So how does this item work? Well, it straight up deletes enemy projectiles. Yep, you heard me right. That includes shots from brass contraptions, alloy vultures, mini mushrooms. Hell, it can even delete malachite spikes that are already on the ground. Honestly, this thing gets an S. It's such a powerful passive for the captain to have, and it is technically obtainable by the other characters. If you're playing with the artifact of vengeance, your Umbra will always drop one of the items you're carrying. So if you're playing the captain and you kill your Umbra, it might drop another one. And if you're playing in multiplayer, someone else can actually pick it up. This is a very impractical and specific scenario, but hey, it's possible. If you want to unlock this thing's entry in the logbook, by the way, that's how you do it. Next, we're going to take a look at the new Lunar Items, the first of which is the Defiant Gouge. This thing basically turns any shrine, including even Shrines of Order and the Altar of Gold, into a Shrine of Combat. Because it requires you to find a certain kind of interactable, it's a little situational, so I'll only be giving it a B. It is very helpful, especially in the early game, assuming you can actually take on the enemies it spawns. In the first few stages when enemy spawns are slow, having one of these can keep the action up and keep the money flowing, meaning you won't have to wait around as long for stuff to keep popping up. Like I said, as long as you can actually take on the extra enemies, it's definitely worth grabbing. Just be careful in the late game. You might forget about it and use a mountain shrine and summon a horde of Malachite Clay Templars that will catch you off guard and insta-kill you. Next up, there's the Mercurial Rakis. Am I saying that right? And this will also get a B. Now, 50% extra damage is nice. It's very nice. I mean, look at the death mark. However, the Rakis is just too random to consistently get your money's worth out of it. Sometimes, yeah, it'll pop up in a perfect spot, but other times it'll spawn right under the Stone Titan that's already lasering you to death. Keep in mind, enemies get the damage buff too when they stand in it. It can be very strong, but it can also be a death sentence. It's just too random for me to feel justified putting it any higher. And next we have the last of the new Lunar Items, the one simply known as Purity. This thing demands you beat the final boss on Monsoon to unlock it, which is no minor task. So it must be really good, right? Well, what does it do exactly? Oh, a flat 2-second cooldown reduction on all your skills. That's not bad. That sounds really nice on stuff with already low cooldowns. Well, it's a lunar, so what's the catch here? Oh, it rerolls all of your on-hit items like the Clover, except it does it for a negative outcome. So what's the verdict? Is the 2-second cooldown reduction worth picking up the item that is the exact inverse of the best item in the game? No. E tier. I don't know why this item is so hard to unlock. The downside is enormous. Let's just compare it to the Clover. So, you have an ATG. Normally, on a 1.0 proc coefficient, 10% chance to trigger, right? Now, with a Clover, you have 2 chances for that 10%, which statistically speaking is about a 19% chance. Big difference, right? Almost double. Super helpful. Now, if you have a Purity, now you have 2 chances for that 90% chance to not trigger it, which statistically gives you a 1% chance to trigger it. Remember my original video, that long list of items I mentioned the Clover effects? It does that to all of those, except Kara and Ronald's band, because of their rework. Cooldown reduction is nice, but it is not worth that downside. I'd rather take an alien head or a hard light or brain stalks or something else any day of the week. Alright, I know what you're thinking. Didn't you say these new items were really interesting and really good? So far we've gotten 2 decent lunars and 1 E tier one. Well, lucky for you, Now I'll be looking at the new equipments, and here's where things will start to get interesting. Firstly, we have Forgive Me Please, which is going to get an A. Now, this thing is crazy strong in the right situation. When thrown out, it activates your on-kill effects once every second for 8 seconds where it lands. This includes things like the Monster Tooth Necklace, Gore's Tome, Fresh Meat, and the real kickers, Will-o'-the-Wisp, and yes, even ceremonial daggers. So chuck this thing at a boss and get 8 wisp explosions off on it. Or, you know, even better, chuck it out literally wherever and get 24 daggers. This thing is insane with the right items. But that's the thing. Like the Death Mark, the doll doesn't do anything for you without the right items, so I can't justifiably give it an S. But it is very powerful under the right circumstance. Next up we have the weakest of the new equipments, Gorag's Opus, which is going to get a solid B. Despite being what I would consider to be the weakest of the new equipments, this thing is still pretty good. The Frenzy buff, previously only obtainable via Berserker's Pauldron, is a strong buff, so being able to activate it on a whim is really helpful, on all allies nonetheless. So why is it in B when Berserker's Pauldron is in A? Well, since you can still get the buff via the Pauldron and it takes up your equipment slot, eventually once you get a Pauldron and are able to get decent uptime on it, it starts to become obsolete, and you'd be better off taking another equipment in its place. However, for the early game, especially in multiplayer or even on Engineer, it's still a very strong equipment up until that point. And the last new equipment is the Supermassive Leech, which will also be getting an A. 20% lifesteal is a lot more than you might think, especially when you consider how much damage you do compared to your max health. You get some pretty crazy damage numbers, so 20% of that is a really good amount. As far as healing equipments go, this one doesn't give you free healing, but it rewards you for staying in the fight longer, and it's potentially the strongest of the bunch. 8 seconds is a solid duration, and if the cooldown were just a bit shorter, I'd say it's definitely the strongest healing equipment, but I'd still say it's comparable to the Wood Sprite as is. Very good item. Finally, we'll be looking at the new boss items. These are definitely the most interesting new items, and they all seem really good at what they do. I saved these for last because I think these will be the most interesting to talk about, so let's get into it. First up we have the Mired Urn, which is the new drop from Clay Dunestriders. This basically gives you the big draining attack that Dunestriders do at low health, but it works a little different. Instead of activating at low health, it's automatically active whenever you're in combat, and it will latch onto the nearest enemy and deal 100% damage per second and heal you for 100% of the damage it does, as well as applying a 50% slow to the target, which is its own unique debuff, so it has synergy with Deathmark as well. The urn gets a solid B. The biggest drawback is that, like the Dunestriders, it targets everything, so it'll target your drones, your engineer turrets, and even your fellow players in multiplayer if they're close enough. If you're just playing solo though, it's a good source of healing and crowd control all in one, especially with more stacks it will target even more enemies. Pro tip for you engineer players out there: Fungus plus Razor Wire plus Mired Urn. Place your turrets close to each other. That is all. Next there's the Molten Perforator, which drops from Magma Worms. The Perforator is a pretty standard on-hit item. 10% chance to fire 3 magma balls that each do 300% damage. So whoa, wait, 10% chance for 3 times 300% damage? That's basically just a better ATG, right? Well, the problem is the magma balls come out of the enemy that gets hit and fire off in fairly random directions, so they aren't super consistent when fighting smaller and or flying enemies. Against larger enemies, however, it does deal quite a bit of damage, and even applies a burn, which is nice for Deathmark purposes. It also doesn't have a proc coefficient like the ATG, which is also a big downside when you're comparing the two. All in all, it gets an A. It does a good amount of damage against bigger targets and does some decent crowd control, but that's about it. And finally, we have the item I've most been wanting to talk about, the Shatter Spleen, which is the new drop from Imp Overlords. I'm gonna be the first one to say it. Holy god, this thing is insane. If you haven't used it yet, what are you doing? As soon as this video is done, go get one and see what I'm talking about. This thing is absolutely bonkers. I honestly think this is the new best boss item by a long shot. So critical hits guaranteed apply bleed, which is even better now after the bleed change, and if an enemy is bleeding when it dies, it explodes, dealing 400% damage, as well as 15% of that enemy's health as damage on top of that 400%. And guess what? The 400% damage and the 15% max health damage both increase with each stack at that rate. Keep in mind, Wisps only do 350% plus 280% per stack. That is an insane amount of damage, especially on bigger enemies like elderly Murians or parents or even bosses. Previously, I had initially planned to give the Shatter Spleen an A because I thought it relied on you having crit chance or tri-tips already, but people recently found out that it also has a hidden 5% crit chance like the Predatory and the Scythe. So now I can justifiably give this thing the S it deserves. I had an overloading elderly Murian Horde of Mini as my teleporter boss on stage 9 one run. There were about 6 of them or so. I kited them around and clumped them together and focused one of them down. When I killed it, the Shatter Spleen explosion one-shot all of them. I only had one Shatter Spleen. I didn't even have any Wisps. This is absolutely the strongest item to come out of this update, and it's definitely my favorite one. If I get Rally Point Delta or Scorched Acres or Abyssal Depths, I'm begging to get Imp Overlords as the boss. It's crazy to me that the Little Disciple actually got dethroned as the best boss item this update, and it got buffed. If you haven't gotten to experience the power of this thing yet, please do. The Shatter Spleen is absolutely one of the strongest items in the game right now. Well, there it is. All the changes to my ranking of every single item in Risk of Rain 2 as of the 1.0 update. Like last time, I'll put up a picture now for TLDW for people, or just a quick reference. If you all disagree with any of my rankings, please let me know. This update's still pretty fresh, and not everything has had time to fully sit in yet, so there might be some stuff I missed. I hope you all are enjoying this update as much as I am. I am having an absolute blast. And now for a quick update about my channel as a whole. I've been in the process of moving since my last video, as well as figuring out this semester, and as you can imagine with everything that's going on in the world right now, it hasn't really been easy. However, as this video's gone up, all of that should be taken care of by now, and I can start to work on videos a bit more. If you're a subscriber from before my Risk of Rain videos, I'll be finishing up Octopath as soon as I can, and for all my new subscribers, I've got a video on all the characters in Risk of Rain in the works, so you all have that to look forward to. After that, I'll just be going with the flow. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I cannot stress it enough. Genuinely, thank you all so much for the response the original ranking video got. It's still beyond me where all of you came from, but all the positive reception from that video means so much to me. Anyways, enough sap. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in another video.